Become a sustaining member of the Commonwealth Club for just $10 a month.
Hello and welcome to today's virtual Commonwealth Club program. I'm Melissa Kane. I'm a political analyst, a lawyer, and a co-host of the podcast Get Out the Bed. It's my pleasure to introduce today Joan Biskupic. She's the CNN Supreme Court analyst and the author of this book, 9 Black Robes Inside the Supreme Court's Drive to the Right and Its Historic Consequences. Now, before joining CNN, Joan was the editor-in-charge for legal affairs at Reuters and was a Supreme Court correspondent for Washington Post and USA Today. She holds a law degree from Georgetown University and has written several books, including biographies of Supreme Court Justices John Roberts, Sandra Day O'Connor, Antonin Scalia, and Sonia Sotomayor. And we've just talked about your illustrious history of writing autobiographies of Supreme Court justices. Can you just start by telling us why this one is more of a comprehensive group picture of the Supreme Court?
Thanks, Melissa. And it's great to be with you and with everyone else from the Commonwealth Club. It's such an exciting time for the Supreme Court, and I could at some point maybe weave in just like what's going on right here now in Washington D.C. involving the court and issues percolating up this way that I'm sure would be of interest to your audience. I had, begun with Justice Sandra Day O'Connor back in 2005, very interested in her, and then went to Antonin Scalia, then a political history of Sonia Sotomayor. And finally, in 2019, I wrote The Chiefs. And as I was casting about for my next project, because clearly I am addicted to writing about this court, beyond just my daily journalism, I thought, who? But there was no person that struck me as someone who was far enough along in his or her career that I could actually assess, and someone who I thought would be interesting enough for audiences like yours. There are some people who've been around for a while, but I thought, I don't know how much more people want to know about them. So I got the idea of a group portrait, and what reinforced my idea of group portrait was what I had started to detect in terms of what was going on behind the scenes because of the Trump effect on the court. So in late 2019, early 2020, I pitched a proposal that to New York publishers that essentially would look at these justices as a group but sort of also get their inside stories woven through, look at relations, who's up, who's down, how that affects rulings. But I really thought I'd have a much more interior look because I didn't expect any real bombshells in rulings. Well, that was, and then of course, this was before COVID also. So not only does COVID happen, but then Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg dies in September of 2020 after I signed this contract. And suddenly we have Justice Amy Coney Barrett come on, and she comes on in late October 2020. And by May 2021, they've agreed to take the big abortion case, the Dobbs case. And that's when I contacted my publisher and said, no matter what deadline you might have thought I was going to make, we just have to put this off for another year because I have to see what they do with abortion. And that also became such a part of the story, Melissa.
Right. Well, one of the really interesting things there are many interesting stories in the book, but I love how you kind of take us behind the scenes. There are some big picture conversations that you cover, but also really intimate details about what it's like on the Supreme Court, which, as you point out, is such a secretive branch of the U.S. government, sort of broadly speaking. And you talk about conferences and sort of how those work. And even for those of us who, I'm an attorney myself, but, we just don't get that kind of information. Can you talk a little bit about how the sort of sausage gets made that you bring to bear in the book?
Sure. And, a lot of people have no idea what goes on in that conference room because, first of all, only the 9 justices are allowed in there. Their law clerks, secretaries, any assistants are not allowed in. So it's 9 sitting around a rectangular table. They're in these big black leather chairs with little brass nameplates on the back. The room is actually kind of small. It's distinguished by a black marble fireplace with a portrait of the great Chief Justice John Marshall hanging above it. And the U.S. reports, as you know well, those books, line the walls. So it's kind of a tight, intimate place. And I have worked very hard over the decades to find out exactly what goes on in there, and then also to find out what happens in the process afterward when, the justices will take a preliminary vote after hearing oral arguments in a case, and they'll take a preliminary vote going by seniority around the table. And then, though, the real action starts. But it's hardly the kind of action that it seems like cinematic, because it's a conversation through exchanged written drafts of opinions. That's how they keep most of their conversation going. There are a couple justices who do like to buttonhole each other in the corridors or drop into offices, but mainly they are sending around draft opinions. They're sending around memos. They're negotiating over paragraphs, and they're mainly, doing the kind of work that any of us are familiar with to produce any kind of written document to try to get at least 5 people on board. But the really interesting things happen when suddenly somebody might want to switch a vote, or somebody persuades somebody to add something that would actually make an important difference in the ruling. And those kinds of actions, I especially like to ferret out.
Well, the other thing that goes on, I mean, in addition to these conference meetings that are very secretive, is you write about the clerk network that really allows a lot of sort of communications to happen between justices and sort of allows certain things to take shape. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because that was a really fascinating part of the book.
Sure. And you might have many lawyers in the audience, as you are a lawyer. These young law clerks are generally the cream of the crop. They're people who went to premier law schools, mostly Ivy League law schools. They've been law clerks to lower court judges. A lot of young lawyers consider this the golden ticket of the profession for a certain kind of practice, mostly, along the Acela corridor, as it's called out here, the East Coast, but also in big cities out west too. People like to tout credentials as a former Supreme Court law clerk. So it's a very competitive position, and each justice.
I'll let you know.
Yes. Yeah. Each justice gets 4 law clerks, and they count on those clerks to help do research, help write opinions, help come up with different legal ideas. But they also, getting to your question about the network, they count on them to keep their ear to the ground. And some justices like clerk intelligence more than others. And I just loved one episode when I was reconstructing what happened in the Title VII case known as Bostock versus Clayton County. That was the one in which the justices decided by a 6-3 vote to expand the reading of Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act to cover gay and transgender workers. So that was a big ruling. And Chief Justice John Roberts went with the majority at the outset on that one. He had a couple of misgivings on some parts of the decision, but he basically wanted to expand the interpretation of Title VII. And I asked one justice how aware they were about this. And I found out that it was the clerk network who had passed on that his clerks were saying that the chief is open to this. By the way, I just caught myself as I was trying to describe something. I'll explain why I caught myself. I try to avoid pronouns of these justices, and I'll tell you why. There are only 9 of us, 9 of them. And all the females are, of course, on the left, and we've got 5 males and 1 female on the right. And sometimes, I have access to many of the justices under lots of different terms, but often the terms involve not revealing who told me what. So I tend to be very careful about if I'm referring to an unnamed justice, watching my pronouns, because I could give a lot away given the makeup of male and female, and also left and right, everything else up there. There just should, some people want to expand the court, for reasons of ideology and politics. I wouldn't mind expanding it to expand my source space.
Yeah, we don't want to have any issues. I'm sure it took you so long to get access to those sources, to get them to trust you. We certainly wouldn't want to have any impact on that. And well, so one of the things, and we've got a audience question about this, and I have a question about this too, is as we're talking about this, and people do take this very, very seriously. Being a clerk, being a justice, of course. So, how, and then you've said before, you didn't think that a clerk or a justice leaked the Dobbs decision. What's your take on what actually happened there, and how did that impact? You read a little bit about how that impacted the court and their cohesion.
Great question. So, why I, unlike many other people, think it wasn't a justice or a law clerk, I've just known so many of them for so long, and I consider them to be mainly rule followers. And those justices have ways to exert public pressure on colleagues that doesn't necessarily involve leaking a 98-page document. And they're also institutionalists in many regards. So I just don't believe a justice did it. And in terms of law clerks, it's the same thing, Melissa. This is a crowd that got to where they are mainly by following the rules, mainly by doing what others thought was right to do. They're super smart people, but they also were doing things, by the book, so to speak. And so that's one reason I think that. The other reason I think is that it's a big building. It's got a lot of people had access to that opinion, probably more than 100. And it was probably copied a lot, frankly. That was a February 10th draft, and it became public on May 2nd. And I think Politico got it, at least a week before then. And I don't believe Politico knows exactly how it got it. I mean, I have never asked those reporters, and I don't intend to, because they got something that was, amazing. It was a sensational scoop. So, and I wouldn't want to say, exactly how did you guys get it so I can trace it back? I'm not going to do it. And the court itself, of course, has had no luck figuring out who did it. They have many more resources than me. But I actually think it might have changed hands. It might have gotten out through a different kind of full-time employee there. It could have been accidentally left somewhere. And someone realized the value of this document and got it into the hands of Politico. And what I say is, I don't know how it got out. I know just about as much about how it got out today as I did on May 2nd. I have lots of theories, but none of which I could actually test. But I do not intend to go to my grave not knowing. But but I do know what the effect was. The effect was to lock in the 5 justices on the right and to secure the kind of language that Justice Samuel Alito was using. I did not think, when I saw the draft on May 2nd, I knew that there were 5 justices who had voted that way. I had known it from my own reporting. But I also knew that the chief, Justice John Roberts, was trying to pick off a vote or two for his decision to uphold the Mississippi ban on abortion at 15 weeks, but not to go so far as to completely overturn Roe v. Wade. So I knew that's what he was trying to do, and I didn't think he was making any headway. But when I was reporting on that, just quietly behind the scenes, we still had like 6 weeks left. And I think, a lot of things had changed in June. There's a lot of action behind the scenes in June. And, but once everything was public, I think that it made it harder for him to make any headway with either Justices Kavanaugh or Barrett. And then the other thing that happened that also surprised me was the tone of the rhetoric. I do think Justice Alito's tone was really strong, more strident than I think that Justices Kavanaugh or Barrett would have written themselves. But I thought maybe they might have bargained for a different kind of language, even though they were ready to overturn Roe v. Wade. But that didn't happen either. And one of the reasons it might not have happened is that they felt, well, the thing's public. Will it look like we caved to public pressure in any way if there are, switch votes, or if the tone of the opinion changes? So it basically preserved on May 2nd what was what had gone on up to that point and did not allow any real action behind the scenes through to June 24th when the decision was released.
Well, we have a question here. Let's give you a
Sure.
hypothetical. Let's say you're at a Starbucks near the Supreme Court building and you
Yeah.
recognize a clerk and maybe you wave and they've got their coffee and then they get up and leave but they leave a folder behind. And in that folder is a draft of the Dobbs decision. Do you report on it? We have a question. If you did get an early decision draft, would you report it? Would you make it public? Especially now that you know what it would do. We know
Well,
that
I love that.
might
I love that
really
question. I love that question because we talked about it here. Now, I have gotten early information over the years, but I tended to, but I've never gotten anything as extensive as that. But I tend to use my early information to then reconstruct a case because I'm so aware of how much votes can shift. So sometimes I'll write that, the farthest I'll go is it looks like they're leaning this way, but that, there are more weeks to come, but I want to tip off readers to where I think things are going. But often I'll just hold my fire. I'll just hold what I've gotten because I'll want to then use it to tell people, okay, we know how they ruled. Let me show you how they got there. And let me show you how, for example, the chief switched votes, or let me show you who was persuaded this way or that way. So that's how I'll use it. And my bosses with whom I've worked on those kinds of stories, we have at times had to weigh whether when we come in with information, if we've gotten something that no one else has, when do we use it? And as I said, we've tended to wait. Now, so say I got access to that opinion, say I was fortunate enough to have it delivered to a secure Dropbox of sorts or find at the Starbucks or whatever. And I brought it back and I said, look at this. And I was able to tell my bosses, this looks real based on, some of the intelligence I've gotten from people inside the court. What do we do? And what we have decided, even though it mostly we've always held stuff until we knew exactly how everything unfolded, we have said to ourselves that we would have run it because we feel like, and I think Politico made the right decision. I know what happened and I know what the effect of it was, but we're in the news business and this was such big news. It was just such big news what they were going to do. And that it would have been hard not to run it.
Honestly, I thought it was fake. When I first heard about it, I was like, that can't be real because it's so unprecedented to have this happen. And you like to think that that they've got really good security protocols, but at the same time, my experience with judges and probably yours too is that they are not lovers of technology. Let's just say that they don't like a lot of passwords and the kind of authenticator apps and stuff like that. So in some ways it's surprising that something hadn't gotten out before with everyone sending drafts back and forth.
Melissa, you just nailed it. First of all, I do have to say that before I got on this call with you, I had one of the younger people in the office come in here with me. I said, just help me get set up, okay? I just have to make this work. It's just been such a big day. There are a million stories going on. Can you just help me get on? And I am sure justice after justice after justice does stuff like that. I don't want to, I used to not be as old as some of the justices, but now that they've gotten so young, I am as old as some of the justices. But still, I know exactly what you're talking about, and they're practically still writing with quill pens. I mean, they do know how to. They do know how to do basic word processing. But you're right. It's just kind of a younger person's game in terms of tech. But with the exception, I should say, of all people, Clarence Thomas, who is right now the eldest of the group, he actually is very tech savvy. Very tech savvy. He was the first one to telecommute. Yeah.
Interesting.
Are
you aware of, with your contacts in the Supreme Court, have they told you about additional security measures being put in place?
They're definitely trying to make sure this doesn't happen again. Can you imagine? I recreate, as you see at the start of that final chapter, that moment where they all had to sit on camera in front of so many people for the John Paul Stevens Memorial, just within days of when they had found out about this leaked draft and before it was public, and they had to act like everything was okay. And I think, how could they have done that? But they immediately, right as soon as they found out about it, like a few days before Politico published it, they immediately started trying to lock down computers and do different things. And in the marshal's report, that she put out in January about, some of the very loose practices they had going about burn bags and number of copies and tracing copies and all that. They have tried to fix that.
Okay, well that's really good to know. I know some of our viewers are concerned, but you also do talk about the collegiality among the justices. I think this is so important. I believe it was Sotomayor. I could be wrong about this. Who you quote as saying something like, I've got to work with these people for the rest of my life, essentially. So they do try to get along personally. But things like a leak, COVID, you point out, there are some strains on some of those personal relationships. Can you talk a little bit about the need for them and the history of them and what's happening currently?
Sure. And I think that's a great question because look, think of the small groups that we're all part of and how we spend more time with some of our colleagues sometimes than with our family. And they always say they are the only 9 individuals who understand the pressures of this job. The last stop in terms of determining the law of the land, the outside pressures, the people second guessing them. So they have kind of a fellow feeling that way. And also the fact that they're appointed for life, they know that they have to. But, as Clarence Thomas himself said after the Dobbs leak, the justices were looking over each other's shoulder. And then he drew a contrast between the Rehnquist court that he had served under for several years and the Roberts court. And he said, that they used to feel more like a family, a dysfunctional family, he said, but more like family. And remember, Justices Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Antonin Scalia had this fabulous friendship despite their differences on the law. And you just don't have as much of that anymore. Justice Sandra Day O'Connor was great as real social glue, trying to always get the justices to, go on outings together, play bridge together. She was the one who started the practice of having lunch together every day after oral arguments. She was, she came up to the court after being a politician in Arizona, a state legislator, and she sort of understood the importance of personal connections.
Right. I mean, you could go all the way back to John Marshall with making sure the justices live together, essentially. And so we get even some of the more landmark decisions like Marbury versus Madison. People forget it was unanimous. He really worked. Ideally, there's this great bedrock of justices getting along. But you write about how the telecommuting actually prevented that personal interaction that really helps the justices to stay connected.
That's right. And, even now, even though they've returned to the bench and they've returned to their chambers, just like a lot of other workers, some of them have gotten accustomed to not coming in as regularly. And I think that has diminished some of the collegiality.
Well, one of the times that we saw what maybe was collegiality, maybe it was something else, was around the issue of Jenny Thomas. And there was a lot of reporting around her support for Donald Trump in various ways, and people calling for Clarence Thomas to recuse himself and for new ethics rules, et cetera. And it seems like the justices really sort of circled the wagons there and, really, said nothing to see here. We're not going to go after our fellow justice for this, or we're not going to create these things. But now we've got issues regarding Clarence Thomas personally, and trips that he took with a friend who also happens to be very, very wealthy, that have come out in ProPublica. What do you make of how the justices might approach that issue? And are we really getting to the limits of what they're willing to do or stay quiet on when it comes to the actions of their fellow justices?
Yeah, so many people say, won't this pressure the court or Justice Thomas to do something? And as much as this latest episode about all the lavish trips that he took on the dime of Republican billionaire Harlan Crow, it's gotten everybody talking. It's gotten everybody scrutinizing the court more. But I just wonder what will happen. First of all, they have kind of a hands-off approach to each other on this topic. Clarence Thomas even put out in his statement, he said he talked to some colleagues and they advised him to not report those trips. The Chief Justice has said nothing about that episode. Members of Congress are clamoring about it, saying, this is ridiculous. You take these really fancy trips and get all this great, food, lodging, travel on super yachts and private jets, and you don't think you need to report that? So, that will change in part because the Judicial Conference has recently made clear that those things should be documented on the annual financial disclosure reports. But, the justices answer to no one. As the Chief Justice has said, they are different from the political branches in that they are appointed for life, and the only way to get rid of them is through impeachment by the U.S. House and conviction by the Senate. And that has never happened. So, but the only time, as some of the audience probably remember or know of, in 1969, Abe Fortas was pressured to resign because of some allegations of financial irregularities. But that's the only time in, more than 2 centuries. So I think things will continue. The chief is concerned about the appearance of the court, but he can't put out a set of rules or an ethics code that will apply to only 5 of them and not 4 others. They have to be, I believe they are trying to be unanimous on something, and maybe they will come up with some sort of new practices that are formal. Just so your viewers know, they say they abide by the code of conduct that that lower court judges are covered by, but they're the only ones who police themselves. And if you had a complaint, like if you, as a lawyer, Melissa, had seen something that one of the justices did and you wanted to file a complaint, they have absolutely no mechanism, no grievance mechanism for any claim against a justice the way you could have against a lower court judge.
Well, I mean, with such an important focus being the legitimacy of the court itself, it's not clear how long that's going to stay the status quo. It seems like there are concerns. You read a lot about Justice Roberts, of course, especially being concerned about the perception of the court and about how even over time that has changed. Can you talk a little bit? You do talk about the Gallup polls and just generally people's trust in the court and how that is really front and center in a way that we haven't seen for quite a while.
Yeah, it's lots of polls led by Gallup, and others that are reputable have documented a real plummeting of public approval for the Supreme Court. Now, the chief says, "Oh, it's just because they don't like some of our rulings," but I think it's not quite the whole story there, because it's dropped enough that it's not just a bunch of liberals who might not like the Dobbs decision, or independents or centrists who might not like the Dobbs decision, the abortion decision. I think people, feel like the court has grown so political and polarized. Donald Trump said he was going to name justices who would overturn Roe, and he named 3 justices who voted to overturn Roe. The alignment right now between justices on one side and another and their political identifications is like just a little too neat for people, I think. The 3 liberals were appointed by Democratic presidents. The 6 conservatives were appointed by Republican presidents, and it used to not be that way. Justice John Paul Stevens, who stepped down in 2010, had been appointed by Gerald Ford in 1975, and Justice Stevens turned out to be quite the liberal.
Well, you do talk about, you just were mentioning how difficult, if not impossible, it is to remove a justice. But there is an issue, and maybe the justices are more aware of it now, that we had the issue with Ruth Bader Ginsburg and her untimely death, and how that impacted the Dobbs decision, and really came at the end of what some people, even maybe President Obama, had been trying to urge her to do a little earlier, so we could get a liberal in her place. Can you write very touchingly about Justice Ginsburg? Can you talk a little bit about that process and maybe how that has impacted the way other justices are viewing their own tenure on the court?
Yeah, no, that's going to be a lesson that they'll all remember. Okay, so I'll just tell people what happened in 2013. By then, Ruth Bader Ginsburg has just turned 80 years old. She's just turned 80 years old, and she's been on the court since 1993. So she's had a long run. And President Obama invites her to lunch, a private lunch. And I got a tip about that. So I followed up with her. And at first I could tell she was reluctant to talk to me about it. But then she said something about, well, I suppose the White House logs might be available. And I thought, I'm not even sure if they are for this one, but go ahead and tell me now anyway. And she said, so he invited her over. She starts describing the soup they had, the fish they had that they ate. And it was, this is just typical Ginsburg, who I cannot imitate her at all, Melissa, because she talked so slowly and deliberately that, I mean, in a way that I admired, but that there's no way I can mimic. But as she was talking to me, she mentioned that she hardly finished her soup when the president had basically finished his entire meal because she was eating so slowly. And then she said, I guess I was done because he had better things to do anyway. But the meal aside, I said, do you think he was fishing for information about your retirement? And she said, no, I don't think he was fishing. I think he invited me because I like him and he likes me. I found out later that that indeed he was interested in her retirement plans, but just did not have the courage to say, "What are you going to do? What are you going to do? And do you need a little nudge? And is there anything else you'd like to do? You're going to be 80. What? Or you are 80. Any way I can help you here? And so what happens? That was in summer of. That was in 2013. And then what happens in 2014, the Republicans take back the Senate and you have a Republican majority through to all of Donald Trump's tenure. And I think Ruth Bader Ginsburg, like many people, thought, well, she just had to hold on till the end of 2016 because Hillary Clinton surely will beat Donald Trump. And of course, that didn't happen. So then she had to hang on until the end of 2020, and she almost got there. But in September, that's when she died.
And just 55 days before the end of the Trump administration. I mean, really just
right
in time to potentially change the Dobbs decision, if I remember reading.
That's exactly right. And one thing, to go to the first part of your question about how other justices recall this, and just how searing it has been for especially liberals, what the fate of Justice Ginsburg. There's a certain degree of anger out there about her decision to stay on, and because it has been so consequential, the fact that she died and was succeeded by someone who is very strongly a conservative, the opposite of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and that has affected Dobbs. That has affected more than just the Dobbs abortion decision, plenty of rulings. But as to the Dobbs one, you're exactly right. That Mississippi appeal, all the papers came in early September 2020 while Ruth Bader Ginsburg was alive. They weren't scheduled to take up the petition until the end of the month. And by that point, she was gone. And they postponed consideration of it for several weeks. And then in May of 2020, with Justice Barrett now sitting in one of those big black leather chairs with the little brass nameplate, decided to take the Mississippi case. And the rest is very consequential history.
And you described that lunch with Justice Breyer, very vivid. I can picture it in New Hampshire, where you went to visit him and you guys had a chat about, and he seemed to be very conscientious about making sure he didn't further change the makeup of the court.
That's right. And so we're in 2021, and a lot of people were putting pressure on him to leave then. And he felt he had 2 years at least, because he thought he had until 2022 before the Senate makeup changed. And it turned out that the Democrats held the Senate, but he didn't want to take a chance on that. But it was 2021, and he was under a lot of pressure. And I love doing this. I just flew up to see him in New Hampshire to his summer home, and I was very excited about getting him to talk to me because he was very helpful in many regards. But I remember he clearly thought he had enough time, and he did. He bet, and he bet correctly. She did not. Her bet did not come in. I mean, she lost that bet. Obviously, the conditions changed from when she first thought she was taking a risk. But Justice Breyer wasn't going to take a big risk. He took maybe a small risk. But then, I don't know if you remember, right away in January of 2022 is when he announced his retirement. So he wanted to make sure that he gave President Biden plenty of time to find a successor, as he did in Ketanji Brown Jackson, a former Breyer clerk. So that one worked out. And I actually think Justice Breyer was fine about how long he stayed. It was a really tough last term for him because like he lost on everything, but he's now, teaching and writing and traveling and having a pretty good life.
Oh, excellent. Yeah. So it's a really neat story about just sort of him, a chief justice, just going down to the restaurant.
Yeah.
It's such a great visual. And so we do have some questions here from the audience. One person wants to know, and this is actually a question I had for later, but we'll go ahead and ask it now. It's what concerns you most about the future of the Supreme Court? Because you make it clear in the book that as the dissenting justices in the Dobbs decision, you don't think that the court is done with overruling prior precedents and doing other things. So can you talk a little bit about what's actually coming or what you think might be coming later?
Sure. And I think these are things that some in your audience can watch for. They right now are considering a major decision, a major case involving racial affirmative action on campuses from Harvard and University of North Carolina. And that's an area where I think we're going to see a reversal of some precedent there also. So that's a big case. We still have some religious discrimination cases coming down the pike, more voting rights cases. What's interesting, we are in April and we have gotten no big rulings, nothing major, and nothing even like better than really small minor. I mean, they are so behind on decisions, and
Why?
I think it's because that's a good question, and I think it's because they're really at odds. I think you're just. I'm sensing much more dissension behind the scenes. I think June is going to be brutal for them, but they have issued so few opinions of note. And one thing that was very much preoccupying me today, and by the time many people see this video, maybe the case will have resolved itself, but right now, moving toward them is the dispute over medication abortion. Judge Kaczmarek in Texas ruled on just a few days ago from when we're taping this to say that the FDA approval of one of the drugs that go into the two-part medication abortion protocol was not properly approved by the Food and Drug Administration. It was just an incredibly strong opinion against the government. The government has appealed it to the Fifth Circuit. For those of you watching here live now, that just happened like just an hour ago and was tying me up significantly. But that's just one piece of what's about to happen. That case is headed toward the Supreme Court. And what I was going to say is that the justices could maybe handle that without hearing oral arguments. But lately they have been trying to actually not use their so-called shadow docket, emergency docket as much, and actually hold arguments and get full briefing on cases of such magnitude as medication abortion surely is.
Did you get a sense that that may be because there was such a public outcry over some really
I think so. I think so. A public outcry, and then some of the justices themselves, Justice Elena Kagan complained to her colleagues in an opinion about the quote shadow docket, and basically saying we're making big decisions without the transparency of oral arguments and full briefing, and in such a rushed fashion. Who wants to make any decision in such a rushed fashion, especially one that could have such consequences?
Okay, right. And you do write in the book for those of y'all listening and watching, there's some great discussion in the book about the justices' approach to gerrymandering and those issues that are probably going to become more and more important as we get closer and closer to the next election. They may be weighing in on several of those as well that could also be really controversial. Another question here. When you started covering the Supreme Court, what surprised you the most?
Oh, gosh. It has, alas, been many, many years ago that I first started covering that. I loved going up there. I mean, again, just as much as I'm sort of addicted to writing these books, I keep changing news organizations, but never changing beats. I just really enjoy the atmosphere of the Supreme Court, trying to figure out the stories behind the stories of the cases. Uh, when I first started, I think the very first oral argument I saw might have been in late 87, early 88. And it was such a different court. I remember thinking, God, I can't, some of these old men, I can't tell from each other, it was, now we've got such a diverse bench. It's easy to keep them straight, but it's steeped in such history that I can appreciate. And, I like that one case builds upon another case, builds upon another case. So I enjoy that about it too. I guess in terms of surprises, how fluid, I learned how fluid the process is behind the scenes. I also learned how no matter how much I find out, there's so much more I don't know. And there's so much more that the justices themselves don't know. Melissa, since you've read it, you know that there are a couple instances where I talk about switched votes and pacts between certain justices. And those are very hard to ferret out. And sometimes I can get information from former clerks. Sometimes I get information from justices. But I've found that sometimes these pacts are made just between two justices, and the others don't know quite why they agreed the way they agreed. And, when I discovered the double switch votes that Chief Justice John Roberts engaged in the Obamacare case of 2012, I remember talking to many justices about that, because that was a case that I really wanted to recreate after the fact. And there was a lot of bafflement still on the part of some of the justices about what exactly had happened and why. So, I don't know much about, you think you don't know what's going on. I know I don't know the full story of what's going on, but some of the justices themselves are even like, what happened? Yeah.
Are they unnecessarily secretive? I mean, you do write about how they're, you ask what kind of Post-its do you use, and they're like, no, we're kidding. I'm making that up.
No,
but it seems like
but it's almost like that. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, the easiest questions. I can see why they wouldn't want the specifics of their deliberative process to be released. And I get that. I get that, especially since we saw what happened with Dobbs. I understand that entirely. But little things like exactly what kind of format are you going to use for the teleconference oral arguments now that you're in COVID? What are you going to do? Can't tell you that. How many votes does it take to summarily reverse in a lower court decision without oral arguments? And I found out that was 6. I find out things, but why can't people know that? Why wouldn't what's so hard about that? Or the other thing that really can irk me and my colleagues is they don't want to tell you ahead of time where they're going to be speaking. Like you're out and about so little, and we really want to see you. So at least give us a heads up so we can buy a plane ticket, so those kinds of things that I think I actually don't understand why they don't want to be more helpful on the easy stuff, because it would just buy them a little bit more goodwill. I don't think that they're many of them just feel like if they had heard me say, why aren't they interested in obtaining more goodwill? They'd think we're not in the business of obtaining more goodwill. We're not in the business of trying to educate you or others. We're in the business of deciding cases. End of story. That's how I think many of them feel.
But they are, aren't they? I mean,
I think so.
They don't have an army,
exactly.
Of course.
That's what I think. Why don't you want to help public understanding of what you're all about? Why don't you, engage more? And you're not going to like the critics on both ends. You're not going to like a lot of the people in the media. You don't even have to like someone like me. I get that. But can you just answer the most basic questions so that people don't get things wrong? I'll put in story. When you probably saw that CNN excerpted 3 of the kind of scoopiest sections of the book, and we did a lot of TV and digital attention around those. And in the one about justices, the Chief Justice working with Anthony Kennedy on a pair of gay rights cases, I included a paragraph that said, it is hard to find out what really happened. And, this is how we find out. And it's limited because you have to, because some other justices might not know. And I'm always very wary about being too chamber centric, getting information from one or two chambers and not the others. So, we often we make clear to readers when we can the limitations. And if I had a nickel for every time I had to put in the story, the court declined comment, the court declined comment, Chief Justice John Roberts declined to comment again. That's why when we did hear from Clarence Thomas on his explanation on the travels with Harlan Crow, it was at least a step forward. But it was interesting that he said, they essentially told me not to report him. But that's then if you go back and you say, okay, well, who exactly? Well, that's all we're saying about that.
Who's they?
Yeah, right. Who's they? Who's they is exactly right. You probably saw in my acknowledgments, I sort of mentioned, in addition to thanking all sorts of people in my life who indulged this pastime of mine, I mentioned how I've always had a mantra about the Supreme Court. This is your Supreme Court. But there was another mantra that more recently has been swirling in my head, or another kind of line that I've thought of, and that came from when a court official said to me when I was asking an incredibly easy question, all things considered, if we had wanted you to know that, we would have told you that. And I thought, why have that attitude? You are part of the government. You are, you have a public face. So anyway, but as I always do say, one thing that will get them together is they will close ranks against press inquiries.
The one thing they can agree on, sadly.
Yes, right.
Well, we do have a question here about the justices and harassment. I mean, so there is, to some degree, I don't blame them for not wanting to talk to the public. It has not gone particularly swimmingly every time they've had interactions. And I'm thinking in particular, the attempt on Justice Kavanaugh. And
exactly.
Alito said that he received death threats as well after the Dobbs decision was leaked. And there was, this idea among, maybe some certain handful of folks that you could stop the ruling by eliminating or attacking one of the justices to change the decision lines. And so I remember seeing video of Justice Kavanaugh's house, and I was surprised at that. You just sort of walk out the front door and there's the sidewalk. I remember thinking, like, you should be living in a volcano, inside of a mountain. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know. It's kind of and I don't know why I should be so surprised, but they actually, are somewhat, have traditionally at least been able to sort of go through the world, stop by a Starbucks, but that seems to be changing.
Yeah, a lot of people didn't know what most of them looked like. I'll never forget during Bush v. Gore, a lot of people kept saying to me, I just saw Chief Justice Rehnquist. I just saw Chief Justice Rehnquist. Because he looked pretty regular and people would mix him up. And many of the justices, could go about in the world without being noticed. But not now, and especially after Dobbs. And I would not minimize the public threat that was to Justice Kavanaugh and that the other justices do feel. And they live, because I live in the northwest part of D.C. I'm close to where Chief Justice John Roberts and Justice Kavanaugh live, and we're talking kind of normal residential areas. Most of them live, a few of them who live a little bit further out have enough property that they've got defensible space there, but some of them just live in regular old homes, and Justices Kagan and Sotomayor live closer into the city, and so you just have people trying to go about their lives, and many of them still can go about their lives, but obviously there's just been there was constant picketing and demonstrating at the homes of Justice Alito, Justice Barrett, Justice Kavanaugh, the chief to some extent. And I'm not sure, I am actually not sure if Neil Gorsuch got as much. He lives a little bit further out.
Okay, interesting. Well, do they have Secret Service detail or?
Oh, it's not Secret Service, but they do have court detail. And now I think it's like 24 hours. Yeah, around the clock. Yeah, they definitely have. They had tight security even before the Dobbs leak, but now they have pretty consistent, nonstop security. Yeah.
Good to know. And
Yeah.
well, one of the things you do talk about in the book, to get back to the horse trading issue and sort of how interesting and difficult it is to kind of untangle that, a number of your stories revolve around Chief Justice Roberts. And but is he still able to do that now that he's sort of outnumbered? I mean, now that you got Amy Coney Barrett, really changed the dynamic of him being the middle, or as it were. I mean, I know he's not a
Yeah.
centrist, but at least he was in a position to really swing things. And now he can, as we've seen, be outvoted. What has that done to the ability of the justices to kind of negotiate, and the Chief Justice to try to do what he feels is right?
Yeah, no, he had a very strong hand, especially in the months between when Justice Kennedy stepped down in 2018 and Amy Coney Barrett came on in late 2020, because he was right smack at the center. And, he's got the power of assignment too. And he's a very persuasive individual. He had argued 39 cases before the Supreme Court, and, just has a very strong, smart, strategic sense in dealing with people. And he still has all those things, but he has five to his right. So he has to essentially join them to work with them. He doesn't want to be a consistent dissenter, that's for sure, because if he dissents, he can't control the assignment of the opinion. So if he is in the majority, at least he gets to assign the opinion, and he can try to work with his colleagues to maybe not go as far as they want to go, or maybe it will encourage him to go further than he might have at another time. So he still has tools, but not as many as he had before. And certainly, as we saw on, such a culture war issue as abortion rights, those tools failed him.
And now, look, we know that the three of the justices that you write about were appointed by Donald Trump, and he's got his own legal issues for now. It's a little bit complicated there, right? Because they have sided with the president on certain things, but certainly not when it came to, say, the January 6th issues and other election related issues in 2020. So can you talk a little bit about sort of how that has shaken out, even though Trump calls him my justice?
Yeah, so in the early years of the Trump administration, his policies were affirmed by this court, by what was then a 5-justice majority. But in part, that was because they were conservative policies that the conservative majority wanted. And I think that individually, they might not have been crazy about Donald Trump, even those three who were named by him, but that they liked where he was coming from on issues of cultural and social policy issues, as well as the strong emphasis that Donald Trump and Don McGahn, his White House counsel, had to roll back the so-called administrative state, to diminish regulations, and they were definitely on board with that. So they were siding with the Trump administration, but they were mainly advancing their own idea of what of limited government. So I think that the Donald Trump's arguments were embraced for a long time. Now, Donald Trump, the person, especially after the election, when it was clear that he did not win, they were not going to be in the camp that went down with him. That's for sure.
And we've seen him, and you do write about this, but we've seen it now again, even sort of daily, about how Donald Trump's approach to legal issues is to really just go for the judge whenever.
Exactly. Yeah, as people remember, the indictment up with the Manhattan grand jury is fairly fresh right now as we speak. And one of his first complaints was that the judge hates me, and he uses such personal language. I remember one time when the Supreme Court ruled against his administration, he tweeted, "Do you get the impression the Supreme Court doesn't like me?" And then, this thing with the Manhattan judge where he said, "This judge hates me," because of how the judge had handled a Trump organization case. So, it's all personal to him. And then he goes after people personally. Yeah.
But does it work? I mean, it seems to me this is his MO, and in his mind, this is the right approach. And either he hasn't sort of changed this tack since his earliest days going after a Mexican judge who's of Mexican heritage. I mean, it's years ago, and now here we are still doing the same thing. Is there a win for him in this?
I don't think there's a win for him, but there's a loss all around, because as the chief will say, is that then gets into the public atmosphere, and people start to think that judges are ruling based on politics, personal preference, ethnicity, whatever. He's so persistently tried to undermine the independence of the judiciary, in part with some appointments, but also through that rhetoric. And I think that it has a cost. That, first of all, I do think the court has ruled in a way that makes people doubt this kind of nonpartisan neutrality, that people really feel like politics has infected the court. But then you also have the rhetoric from a man who lots of people still believe in, Donald Trump, saying essentially you really can't look at these people as neutral arbiters. They are motivated by politics. They're motivated by their dislike of me. They're motivated by things that are not the law and the facts of a case. And I think that's definitely out in the atmosphere. Each time Donald Trump, has some episode where he's more and more in the public eye, and people think, now what will happen? Now what will happen? But he still has a lot of supporters, and his message that a lot of supporters keep listening to, this drumbeat of the judiciary is not independent, the judiciary is not fair, the judiciary is just a bunch of political types, mostly liberals who are against me, as he would say. And I think that gets communicated.
In the media, though, I mean, is it important to emphasize? I mean, there are lots of decisions that don't break neatly along party lines. I think the vast majority don't. It's certain, very high level ones that I think that people are really paying attention to, and sort of has this drama around them. But a lot of them are either unanimous or have different alliances. I mean, is there an obligation there to try and emphasize and cover those cases as vigorously, to remind people that there is actually a lot of agreement and it's not so cut and dried at the court?
Well, that's a good question. And the justices themselves are always saying, just look at the percentage of how we're unanimous. Well, I bet when we get to the end of this term, that percentage will have dropped a lot. Mm-hmm. And the reason we don't spend as much of our airtime on those decisions, even though we acknowledge them, is because those are the ones that truly are more cut and dried, and that they don't inspire the same public passions. They might not be as consequential. Like, let's just take medication abortion. That kind of ruling right now that's, so divisive out in the country is worth, writing about and talking about, so people understand what a close call that might be, just like the abortion Dobbs decision. Whereas a case that's unanimous, that is unanimous because it involves maybe tax law, is important to record, but it might not be as important for how people are living. Like, each corner of your life is going to be affected by a ruling on tax or a ruling on patents, or like those rulings are important. And when they come out unanimous, that's great, but it's not where the rubber really meets the road for this court.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, we are still getting lots of great questions coming in. We've got this. How
many minutes do we have? Just so I know.
We have like 7 minutes left, so I'm gonna get you like 2 more questions. Okay. A question here. Sorry, this is a little different. We're going to switch gears a little bit. It's a little more personal. If you had the opportunity to interview a past or present Supreme Court justice, who would it be, and what would you ask them? Who's your dream Supreme Court interview?
Oh, wow. Well, there would be many. I mean, a bunch of names just popped into my head. Like, obviously, the great Chief Justice John Marshall. Wouldn't that be great? Wow. But then more contemporary, just because I've gone through his papers a lot, is William Brennan, who I knew briefly, but then he left the court in 1990. So I was basically, just coming in around then. But I've gone through a lot of his papers, and he fascinates me because he was so aware of counting votes. All he did was count votes. He was just, that's what his life was like. So he's interesting. But, Lewis Powell, I've done a lot of work in his papers, and I knew him cordially, but I would have loved to have like spent more time with him. I was lucky enough to spend time with Chief Justice William Rehnquist when he was chief, and and Earl Warren. So like I have no again probably I thinking of someone like John Marshall or Chief Justice Charles Evans Hughes, who handled the whole court packing threat back in the 30s. Like, so those historical figures would be fun for the historical side, but then for like getting into the nitty gritty of cases, like someone like Bill Brennan. But he has left behind a trove of great papers. So I loved going through those.
Excellent. Yeah. John Marshall. I don't even know if I have a question for him. I just kind of want to
be in his presence.
I just want to hang out.
Yeah. Right.
I just want a burger. I just want
to. That's good.
All right. This person says, you covered the Clarence Thomas hearings with Joe Biden as chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee. Any thoughts on that looking back from today?
That's a great question, because I have written that story a million different ways, because I was right there covering it at the time. And I was pregnant at the time. My daughter, who is now 30 years old, was with me in utero, and she has a real fascination with the Clarence Thomas hearings, even though she has no interest in law, journalism, or she's a theater kid. And but she thinks it's because she was like there at the scene. So I remember those hearings vividly, wrote about them, and then continued to write about them and up through Joe Biden's presidential campaign, because I wanted to remind people of what he had done. It comes up a lot, and he has said that he has misgivings for how he handled it. But it is just because he didn't have other women testify, and the nature of the questions to Anita Hill were just kind of crazy probing in some ways, and so there was a lot of a circus spectacle to those hearings, as Clarence Thomas said, but everybody had some missteps there. But Joe Biden was in the chair and probably did the best he could for that moment. But certainly lots of people remember it. And as I said, it did come up in his campaign. And I think that he in the end calls Anita Hill around the time that he's running for president. And I know that she had written plenty about how she felt about his stewardship of the committee during that. But in the end, I think faced with Donald Trump and Joe Biden, we know where she would have cast her vote.
Well, yeah, I mean, those videos, though, are kind of hard to watch. I mean, C-SPAN, if those are out there listening,
everything's out there.
You can go watch it on C-SPAN. I did, a few years ago, and I was like, oh gosh, this is really something. Okay, so we have time for one more question, and the last question is from one of our viewers, and they want to know: do you think we will ever see an increase in the number of justices on the Supreme Court?
I don't. And it's because despite the fact that a lot of progressives would like to expand the number of seats or even, impose term limits, there just isn't the political will for that. Even President Biden, who, could potentially have an interest in having a larger court, more appointments, and not so lopsided conservative, is against it. And I think there just is not the political momentum for it. It would take an act of Congress to expand the number of seats, but an act of Congress certainly is easier to get than an amendment to the Constitution. And arguably, it would take an amendment to the Constitution to impose term limits on the justices who are appointed for life. So.
Right. And the only scenario I can think of is if there was some kind of agreement to have, say Democrats appoint one and Republicans appoint one. And so there's, you say, okay, we'll have 11 and each of us gets one, because no side is going to let the other side get elected.
So then what would you accomplish?
Well, it just, we do know that they get, far more petitions than they can ever really rule on in a year. It would actually be more of an issue related to workflow and sort of the amount of decisions they can make and the amount of questions that are coming in. And so it would be, you just accomplish more. More stuff getting done, more decisions getting done, but that would be the only justification for something
more
like that.
People to talk to me.
Yeah, exactly. More stories to cover, more confirmations for you to report on.
Right.
Well, Jim, thank you so much for taking time out of what I know is probably a very, very busy day and busy week and busy month for you over there covering the Supreme Court. We want to thank you so much. She is the author, Joan Biskupic, the author of Nine Black Robes, Inside the Supreme Court's Drive to the Right and Its Historic Consequences. We encourage everyone to pick up a copy of Joan's book at your local bookstore. If you want to watch more programs or support the Commonwealth Club's efforts in making virtual and in-person programming, please visit commonwealthclub.org/events. I'm Melissa Kane. Thank you for joining us. Take care, everyone.